We are in the midst of a sermon series on mountains in the Bible. We started with Noah on Mount Ararat, looking out on the world with the floods diminishing. And then we went with Abraham to the mountain with Isaac, Mount Moriah, where we learned that God does not require the sacrifice of children. And Cammie last week took you with Moses to the mountain where you saw the burning bush. Well, today we're back again with Moses, but we're on a different mountain. The mountain is called Pisgah, or it's more commonly known as Mount Nebo. And this is where Moses has come to the end of the journey with the Israelites after having come through the wilderness, after having left Egypt. And he's standing on the mountain, and he's looking out on the promised land. But he knows that this is as close as he'll ever get before he dies. It's a bittersweet moment. You can't help but be filled with pathos, imagining this great leader of Israel standing alone on the mountain, the presence of the Lord surrounding him, the wind gently blowing through his long white beard, listening to the silence as he gazes across the mountains. If you've ever been on top of a mountain, you know the feeling. You're aware that you're as high as you're ever going to be, and you've been granted a view of the surrounding landscape that is unparalleled. It fills you with feelings of majesty and awe. But there's also a certain sadness, because you know you can't stay on the mountaintop forever. Eventually, you have to come down. The clean air, the stunning view, the feeling of being close to heaven. Eventually, it's just going to be a memory when you come back down. And for Moses, when he leaves this mountaintop, he knows that it's even worse for him because he's going to his death. He must have lingered there on that mountain for many hours before he heard the voice finally say, "Come on, Moses, it's time to go." And then, with a heavy sigh, he tears his eyes away from this last best view and goes down the mountain. What makes this scene especially heartbreaking is that Moses knows that after all of these years wandering in the wilderness, he will never step foot in the promised land. He brought the people out of slavery in Egypt. He endured hardships with them in the wilderness. He put up with their complaining and their whining and their near revolts. And after all of that, his final hope will never be realized. And it's all because of one mistake, one instance of faithlessness that results in Moses coming away from Mount Nebo with only a distant view of the land of milk and honey. Have you ever worked so hard for something, endured so much, withstood so many hardships, only to be turned away when you thought you were about to reap the reward of your labor? The heartbreak can be crushing, especially when it appears that God is either punishing you for your mistakes or is simply not following through with a promise that you thought had been made. Perhaps you have stood on your own Mount Nebo, wistfully gazing into the distance at what you thought was your destination, only to learn that, in fact, you will never actually get there. Many of you have heard about the refugee crisis at the southern border of the United States, where tens of thousands of children from Central America have flooded facilities seeking asylum. Many people think that the children are sneaking in illegally or trying to bring in drugs, when in fact, they have presented themselves to Border Patrol as asylum seekers, and so they are in the country legally. But the rhetoric about these children has gotten more heated and hateful. The facts are that these are children, most of them are without their parents, they are lost, alone, and afraid. And for many of them, they are like Moses on Mount Nebo. wistfully viewing a land of safety from afar, but they'll never actually get there. Bishop Michael Reinhardt, Lutheran bishop of the Gulf Coast Synod, visited the transition centers and talked with the children and the social workers and volunteers and border patrols and lawyers. He explained in a blog on the internet that the violence in Central America is on the rise. Honduras, where a lot of them come from, has the highest murder rate in the world. One of the boys that he met is age 13 and was told by the gangs that run Honduras that he either had to join them or they would kill him. And he refused, and so they beat him nearly to death. A year later, they came back and said the same thing. You either join us or we will kill you. He refused again, and so they ran over him with their car. His mother gave him $30 and told him to go north. He hitchhiked on trains through Mexico. There he was kidnapped and held for ransom, but managed to escape. And then he crossed the river and presented himself to Border Patrol. He was put in a detention center where he was treated harshly until a local sheriff stepped in. In time, he was settled with a foster family, but then was picked up by immigration and now waits behind bars for his fate, either to go with another foster family or to be sent back to the gangs in his homeland. Like Moses on Mount Nebo, this young boy, along with the rest of the children from the border, was fleeing violence and oppression in a land where they were treated as nothing more than slaves for the gangs. Like the Israelites who had fled from oppression and violence and slavery in Egypt, they journeyed in the wilderness and all its many dangers, hoping against hope that they would make it to the promised land of our country where they will be safe. But so many of them will be turned away by a nation fearful of them and what people think they bring with them. Diseases, drugs, laziness, unwillingness to learn the English language, another mouth to feed and take advantage of the system. They, like Moses, will come away from Mount Nebo with nothing but frustrated hopes and disappointment, and many will face certain death if returned to their home countries. You may have strong feelings that these children should not be allowed in this country. But regardless of your feelings, there's something we can learn from these children, from their faith journey, just as we can learn from Moses. When he stood on that mountaintop, knowing that he had failed, he did not whine about it. He did not blame anyone. He did not try to argue with God. He willingly passed on the mantle of leadership to Joshua, not holding on to the reins of power like so many other leaders. He entrusted his life and his death to God. These children at the border have also entrusted their lives to God. The Reverend Bishop Claire Burkett of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Synod, in a sermon to the women of the ELCA a few weeks ago, shared some very moving stories of people in the church ministering to those children and seeing what kind of faith they had. She shared about a woman named Martha and her husband Gabriel. They have opened their homes to these children as part of a network of transitional group foster homes. Since the facility opened in April, they have taken in over 80 children who have been guests in their home. The children are afraid when they come to us, says Gabriel. But this is their promised land, given everything that they've been through. These children come with remarkable faith. We pray with them at night and before meals. Some of these children become little evangelists because they are welcomed here and their faith is nurtured. In the faces of Martha and Gabriel and the children, you can see the faith of Jesus. You see, the church comes alongside those who stand on Mount Nebo and reminds them that no matter what they face on the way back down the mountain, God is still with them. There was a woman named Kathy Hertzberg, who's a member of an ELCA congregation in Texas. She volunteers with other Lutherans and Catholics, and they work one of the facilities. They volunteer to feed and clothe and care for the border children. Every day, volunteers launder 10 to 20 loads of clothing and bed sheets 7 days a week. Love and laundry. That's how the church stands on Mount Nebo with those in need. Because Christians are reminded of another refugee who fled with his parents from a land where he was facing violence. The child Jesus was a refugee from the murderous rampage of Herod and his gangs, seeking asylum in a foreign land. Ironically, that land was Egypt, where his ancestors had enslaved his people. But apparently, the hearts of the people in Egypt since that time had softened and changed, and they were kind enough to allow Jesus and his parents to enter their country. Later, as a grown man, Jesus would come to know the same frustration as Moses, having traveled in his own wilderness, trying to lead people to the promised land of God's love and forgiveness and reconciliation. But like Moses on Mount Nebo, Jesus would end up standing wistfully on the mountain, saying, "How often have I desired to gather your children together like a mother hen gathers her brood under her wing, and you were not willing." You see, the church has not forgotten this longing of Jesus to reach out to children and care for them. While others may be screaming at the children to leave or bringing in soldiers with guns to keep them away, the church stands quietly with her arms outstretched like a mother hen welcoming her children. There is a sign out in front of Martha and Gabriel's home. In Spanish, it says, "La última parada de un largo viaje, bienvenido." In English, it says, "The last stop of a long journey. Welcome." Perhaps Moses, too, felt welcome when he came down the mountain. He had entrusted his life to God. God had never abandoned him, and he knew with certainty that his people would make it into the promised land. And so he could entrust his death to God. Perhaps you too can come to trust that no matter what frustrations you've experienced, no matter what failed hopes you've suffered through, there is a welcome sign put out for you too. The welcome sign was put out for you as you entered the promised land through the waters of baptism. The welcome sign is put out for you every week when you come to the table and you taste the bread of hope and the wine of forgiveness. And when you make your final journey down the mountainside, the welcome sign will be there for you too, in the shape of a cross of the one who entrusted his life and death to God and his resurrection to God. La última parada de un largo bienvenido. The last stop of a long journey. Welcome.